Do you
So
have
now
any
that we know
ideas
the
about that?
definition and the purpose and
We're all
the
excited about discovering now.
Oh, you'll be so disappointed in this now.
Thanks for joining us. This is the June 25th, 2025 episode of Ask Some Praxis. We're going to be talking about getting started with your intranet upgrade discovery. So, how do you get started with an intranet upgrade? How do you start to think about that activity? And you may notice that several of our colleagues are not here today. You've got the little crying faces next to Derek and Julie. They are out in Seattle at TechCon 365. I'm sure they're learning all kinds of things and having wonderful connections with people out there. So today's topic, again, getting started with your intranet upgrade discovery. So first, we're going to talk about, well, what's the purpose of discovery? Why do you even do discovery? And then what are the main discovery activities? Actually, I should stop and say one of the reasons we decided to do this topic is both Carrie and Patrick recently went to a Nielsen Norman training course on discovery. So we're all learning from them, and we're expanding the way we think about it at SimPraxis. But they got some great learnings out of it, so we figured we would share some of that in our unique SimPraxis way. So discovering activities, how do you get started? How do you define the problem? What kind of research, analysis, and testing do you do? What outputs come out of those discovery activities? What do you end up with? And then after discovery, what happens? Patrick, take it away.
Sure thing. So I'm just going to want to start with the broad scope discovery, because of course, we all have an answer to the question, what is a discovery? So Nielsen Norman is known for their usability and how people use websites as well as other digital media and such. So discovery refers to the preliminary phase in the UX design process that involves researching the problem space, framing the problems to be solved, and gathering enough evidence and initial direction on what to do next. I think this applies to many projects, but specifically it works for intranets, because one of the things that we always need to keep in mind that other than content, the reason we're doing this is for the usability and the users who are trying to find the information that's out there. So discoveries can help set us up for success and ensure the focus is on the right problem to solve, leading to the right answers. They may start with one small problem, which we've all heard of before. Someone says that this is what we need to solve for, and the point of the discovery is, well, we might get to the end of the discovery and realize that no, that's actually minor compared to the bigger problem, which is people can't figure out what their benefits package is, or where the office location is if they're going out of state. So the real thing is focusing, I just want to repeat this, right problems to solve, leading to the right answers. Does anyone else have any thoughts on discoveries and what a discovery project would mean to them?
Well, I think one of the things we have a tough time with sometimes with our clients is getting them to understand the value of a discovery. And they just, so they skip right past the defining what the problem is and wanting the solution. And I think getting people's heads wrapped around the fact that we need to do this discovery to get the right questions so we get the right answers. And sometimes the light bulb comes on, and sometimes it's like pushing a rope. It's really tough.
It's hard for us too, because we know we have all these great tools at our disposal that can make some major improvements to people's pain points, and we want to fix those things. So it's sometimes hard for us too to reel it back and just make sure we're really hearing what the true issues really are. So I think it kind of is for everybody. It's a little messy.
Yeah, I think a lot of people want to just jump right into solutioning. They want to just start building things to solve the problem without really knowing what the problem is yet. So taking that sort of step up front and saying, okay, let's let's make sure that we know what we're going to do. I've described it to a lot of clients as, you know, we're at point A, we think we're going to point B, and in actual fact, we're going to wander over to point C, which was the right place to go in the first place. That's that Shangri-La you wanted on that trip that you took that you didn't realize was even out there. Carol, your hand is up.
Yes, I recently started a process with a company, and the CEO said when I said that I wanted to talk to end users, you know, frontline employees, he said, they don't know.
Mm.
And I didn't, like, I was so stunned that I didn't even respond for a minute. But we kind of worked around that. But that was really startling to me. But I bet he's not the only person that thinks that.
Not at all.
So
No, you're 100% correct there, Carol. And one of the things that I think is in our toolbook is to kind of talk to people like that at using their language. So you talk about KPIs and things like that to kind of put it in a different perspective. You know, we talk to end users, which helps provide a milestone when the project is done that they can then look back on and say, oh, okay, so we actually did do the right thing. You know, people are using this and we're not getting in as many questions. So calls to the help desk are down, or, you know, people are more efficient in the way they do things. So part of that is getting their buy-in by talking to them in a way that they understand, generally around money or you know, the speed in which people can get their jobs done. So, you know, optimizing things like that.
that's what we're ending up doing. I actually, the proposals due at the end of the week, but it's heavily leaning on efficiency. Here's how we can make this process much faster, much smoother, reduce questions, exactly what you said, because you're right. The money is what people like to hear, I think.
And I'm going to walk back what I just said and apologize, Carol, because I feel like I just mansplained you and you knew exactly what I was talking about and what to do. So I'm sorry.
No, you did not. You did not. You're fine. But I appreciate that.
Okay, so yes, I mean, I think what we're getting from this is that there's lots of different ways to talk about discovery, and it is often difficult to get people to buy into the process and frankly what that entails. One way to kind of think about it is what Mark switched to here, called the double diamond thinking method. I called it the 4 Ds of discovery, which is discover, define, develop, and deliver. And Mark hinted at this a little bit when he was talking about when we do discoveries, we're solving for a problem. When in actuality, that's not really what a discovery is for. Discovery may start with what someone thinks the problem is, but at the end of the day, the discovery helps us find what that problem, or in a better term, opportunity is. Whether that is a whole new website, whether that's a different way of thinking about how something is being presented to a customer or your employees. There's lots of different ways to think about it. So 4Ds, we kind of start with a challenge or problem that we want to solve. We do some discovering using some interviews, interviewing both stakeholders and users. I think that is key. That's something that we're really starting to emphasize a little bit more. Because stakeholders may not understand. They have a certain understanding and they have certain goals they want to accomplish, but the users who are going to be using the internet may be looking for different things. They may have different ideas. So the thought is to interview both stakeholders and users, and then use that to research what define where the problems actually are. Once complete, we kind of move on to the development plans to work towards a solution. Once we have one, we can deliver the end result. And because we spent time up front working with the users, we have that starting point to measure our KPIs when it comes to success. So it kind of, you can see, looks like 2 diamonds together. We've got the discovery phase. You've got the defining what you find in the discovery. Then you might develop something, and then you have your final delivery or solution. And there's not every project that is going to run this way. It could be that the first diamond is smaller in some projects. It could be that is much larger and the problem that needs to be solved is much smaller. So the develop and deliver side is much smaller. But another way to think about this is that these diamonds are problem space, building the right thing, and a solution space, building the thing right.
I think
So
with when we do discovery projects, Patrick, with our clients, we're almost aiming at the intersection of those two diamonds, right? We're trying to understand enough about the problem space so that we can come up with a roadmap and a plan of action to do the second diamond. So sometimes we do a little bit of developing in that first diamond because we're prototyping something. Like what if it looked like this? Would these kinds of these kinds of tools actually make this work better? But for the most part, we're not building things. We're we're discovering and defining. And I think another word that's useful there is refining the ideas that we have. And then we have a roadmap, and that helps us understand how big is the breadbox? How hard is it going to be to do the things that we've learned in discovery? And how, in the case of working with Simpraxis, how much is it going to cost? But sometimes that's enough for our clients to take and do the thing themselves. Not often, but sometimes. And that way, it's a place where we can sort of divide the effort if we need to. Next slide.
Yes. So the purpose of discovery, kind of hinted at this a little bit, but it's generally to highlight what the potential problems or pitfalls might be with the current internet or the current system that people are generally looking to find content. It can also highlight what's working well. So if there's one department that has done a really good job, then it could be working well, or the navigation is set up correctly. There's lots of different ways to do that, but we won't know that until we start digging into discovery. What we mean by discovery, obviously, we've talked about it a little bit, is interviews. It is important to interview the stakeholders, who are the people who are reaching out to us to have a project done. It could also be reaching out and talking to those users, because it really is important. And it doesn't have to be a large cross-section of users. It could be 5 users. It could be 10 users. But it's coming up with a set of questions to ask them and almost do some user testing. So, some generic questions, maybe 20 minutes per person, just to try to work some of that into the discovery. Because I think what we can find out there is that there's a lot of important information that the stakeholders may not be thinking about, but that we can then harness to help figure out where some of those real problems or obstacles lie. Discoveries can also help you find a competitive advantage between you and your client's competitors. So say that you have 2 banks, you could look at a couple of other websites and see what they're doing that you might be able to do better. And then we also have the overall discovery, which is high-level overarching thing, which in our instance is moving from shared drives to M365, versus departmental discovery, which is more honed in on a specific thing. But both of them are necessary. You can't really do one without the other. And what you may discover is that some departments may have a better handle on this than others. And if you can start getting maybe some SharePoint super users in there, a team created for people who own other sites, they can start helping out with some of the people who are rather new to it.
Yeah, I think one big value of talking to end users with discovery is part of it is seeing how they bend SharePoint to do the things that they want it to do. But the other thing is, as a SharePoint admin, I'm not a great SharePoint user, and I always learn something about SharePoint when I talk to end users about how they use SharePoint. I just learned something about the product. And so a lot of times, even when I'm talking to the key stakeholders for a client, they're the same way I am. They're very pigeonholed in what they know about the product. And so we come back to them and say, your end users are having a problem because they're trying to do this, or this, or they're using this to do this. And there's, often someone in the room like, you can do that? Like, I had no idea. So talking to end users, while it can sometimes feel tedious, is endlessly educational.
And it can be a tough sell. I mean, it can cost money, but I think the value add from the usability aspect and making sure people can find what they're looking for and making sure that key information is front and center sets you up for a more successful integration, a more successful adoption of how people look and find their information, and saves people time.
Yeah.
Building the right thing is way better than building things fast. So Carrie, what do we
Yes.
do when we think about discovery? Do you
So
have
now
any
that we
ideas
know the
about that?
definition and the purpose and
We're all
the things.
excited about discovering now.
Oh, you'll be so disappointed in this now. So, Patrick sort of laid the groundwork of the definition and the purpose and why we want to do these things, right? These next few slides are just more about like the activities and how to sort of prepare and lay the groundwork for having a successful process, right? So, tasks is, I guess, the first thing I would sort of focus on if you're in this discovery sort of process for your company, just outlining what we plan to do, like what constitutes this discovery, right? What do we plan to do during this whole sort of phase? And so examples of that, especially geared toward this episode, which is Intranet upgrade, could be, research, right? Like, what do we plan to do in terms of research? Do we plan to do interviews? Maybe we want to run some reports on how the internet's being used, the usage, the inventory of the content that we have, and then sort of like, what are our outputs going to be at the end? So outlining all these tasks of like, these are the things we want to do and produce by the end of this phase is super helpful, right? Because you kind of know where you stand in the grand scheme of things. The other thing is time, right? So these can be short, they could be long. I think I just put in the chat, they could be sort of strategic and broad. They could be a little bit more focused and tactical if, you sort of have a very more narrow space of what you're actually trying to do from the get-go. So the time limit is going to vary, right? And, if you have a lot of time, you'll take a lot of time, right? So I think time boxing what those tasks are that you already identified into sort of logical buckets of like when you want to, achieve those things kind of helps. And it also helps so that you don't take too much time on one thing and not enough on the other. So like you could take weeks and weeks researching this stuff, but your analysis phase might be much more, limited in scope because you ran out of time. So I think, maybe having your first week or day or whatever that time frame is, that first section as more of your kickoff and defining the problem and making sure that you're good on that, then moving into your research and then making sure you have time to analyze what all of your team members have learned about all the things that are related to this particular project, and then having a time to produce some of those outputs at the end. Okay, so like the tasks are important, kind of time boxing them also helps. And then identifying your team. So who are the roles that are going to be involved with this? This could be 1 to 2 people, it could be up to 5 people, it can really depend, but you may have some team members that are more inclined to do certain things. So if you have a more technical person on the team, maybe they want to run more of the reports and do some of the analysis on what they're finding. At the same time, perhaps some of your team members are doing some of those, user interviews or meeting with stakeholders. So knowing what those roles are and assigning those tasks that you've time boxed is definitely going to help. And then lastly here is just ways of working. We do this at Simpraxis where, we upfront make sure that we're all aware of where and how we're going to collaborate on this sort of effort, right? We're all going to be gaining information and sharing ideas. We'll have questions. Where do we sort of clarify those in a timely way to keep moving on this process? And so, just making sure we have those norms set up early is helpful, and that everyone is comfortable with those, right? If folks aren't using Teams, then maybe a Teams channel isn't the way to go. Or maybe it's a good time to introduce something like that, but just making sure that we're all in the right sort of method of doing that definitely helps. So this is sort of just your getting started, how to sort of prepare and kick off the real work, which is our next slide, which is really about the actual process of discovering and actually seeking that information.
One of the companies I worked for years ago used to call it storming and norming, this phase, right? It's sort of an uncomfortable jockeying for position, getting to know each other, part of figuring out all of these things.
Yep, for sure. We actually heard that term too, Mark, in the class, it is a little bit of that, like sort of understanding what your position is in this process, how you're going to communicate, and sometimes you're not going to agree, and how do we come to a consensus to move forward, and that's that sort of storming part that you were talking about. Okay, so this is like the nitty gritty. This is the really more the messy part that we were kind of talking about, right? Is defining the problem and just really trying to find that root problem of what like the real issue is. I have asking why here because, you know, in this course, we talked a lot about using the 5 whys method of sort of just repeatedly asking why, just to try to get to the root of the problem. I think it was Toyota. Motor company that kind of started with a lot of this stuff using these techniques, but essentially, you know, using this to try to get to that root, you know, that root problem. So for the example of our intranet upgrade, this could be, you know, a stakeholder saying that like our intranet is outdated or it's hard to find information. And so, you know, it's not just ask why, but like, you know, frame it such that, well, why do you say that? You know, well, users are finding it really difficult to find things. Geez, why do you think that is? Like, why do you think that is? Well, I think our navigation's a bit confusing. And then you're like, well, why does it vary so much from site to site? Why is it so confusing? Well, that site architecture wasn't really designed with, you know, with users in mind, or we didn't expect each site to sort of organically grow and evolve the way they did. So you get the gist. You keep asking those clarifying questions to sort of get to the point of, well, the root cause really here is that there wasn't a good defined architecture, which we talk about all the time, but also there weren't any real governance policies in place to maintain that. So asking those questions, and not in a confrontational way, because, you know, the empath in me is like, I don't want to be like, why? But if you really dig a little bit and do it in a way that gets them really thinking, I think you really do get to that root of the problem. And so having all that information just helps you sort of frame what that statement is at the end of the day. So you want to sort of have this succinct sentence or two that really says, this is the problem and this is why it's important that we're solving it. And so anytime you're going throughout the process, you want to sort of look back to that problem statement to make sure that you're doing things in alignment with solving that problem. And so it's important to kind of have that tucked away somewhere. And as Mark mentioned, this isn't the solutioning or solutioneering that people want to do, right? This is that time where you want to like define the problem, but also like, but we could do this. This is where you got to be really careful about keeping it sort of agnostic in terms of solutions.
I think that's,
yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that's what Dan was just talking about too. I think that's one of the struggles with discoveries is that you can sometimes unravel more problem statements. So you have your key one that you're starting with, and then you can end discovery with 10 more, and trying to find that balance of where to start and what the priority is can be one of the fun aspects of discoveries.
Yes, yep, for sure. And I think, you know, just to wrap this slide up and just to move on, I mean, you want to have a goal for the end of this thing, right? Like, what are our outputs going to be? But more importantly, like, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? And we always talk about that. And how will these sort of, how will this research and these outputs that will help us visualize that help us get to those outcomes? And so you really want to kind of have some of that at the end as well. Okay, and then I'll kind of skim through this. This is really probably the bulk of it, but this could go in a million ways, right? Research can be a million different things. We talk a lot about the content inventories because it really helps us understand the scope of what we're dealing with and maybe what we're not seeing. Sometimes it's just helpful to say, hey, you talk about all these things, but we're not even seeing that as part of our research. Well, maybe those particular files are in someone's OneDrive, or, you know, it just really kind of opens the box of like, wow, there's a lot here that we actually need to uncover. And then, you know, doing those user interviews, being able to sort of ask stakeholders and users from both perspectives, who's managing the content as well as who's consuming the content, right? So it's kind of a double user base for everything if you think about it. So just, you know, just making sure you're like talking to the right people and also observing. Like I do this sometimes where sometimes I just don't even know the question to ask. And it's sort of like, well, show me how you do that thing that you were talking about. Like, how are you uploading the file? Like, where do you go? Or where do you search for your holiday schedule? Like, are you going at the top? Like, and just watching someone do that sometimes is really helpful to understand, is it a training issue? Is it actually really the technology? So that's sometimes helpful before you kind of analyze and do all of your prototypes and testing. So all of this to say, they're all, ways to get to our outputs, which is really our deliverables and our ways to sort of illustrate this back to the stakeholders and the users as you're ending this phase, which I think Mark is going to talk a little bit more about the outputs.
So what you want to end up with is ways to really talk through the points on this slide. So a better understanding what the actual problems are you're trying to solve. Some of the problems that you're trying to solve might be really simple. Like one of the things we do is look at the settings in the tenant and just make sure that, like privacy setting, or not privacy, sharing settings are what you think that they are, that whether or not you're using you're allowing external users in. So they could be really simple problems with really simple answers. Check this box, save that setting. But in most cases, it's broader clarity on the problem. These are, we're, instead of the 12 sites that you thought you needed, you really need 15, and they're going to be configured in a different way. So you get a much better understanding of where you're going to aim for when you're building things. Oftentimes, as we've stated multiple times, I think it's important to state it again, it's not always what you thought you were going to be doing before you started this process. You also do identify a lot of other opportunities. That's a great word, opportunities, isn't it? We talked about it in a couple of different contexts. One of the things that we try to do during discovery is collect all of the, sometimes I call them wacky ideas, or unexpressed needs or possibilities, and you're really building that superset of, these are all the things we could do, but this is the set of things that we're going to do in the next phase of work, or in phase 3, or in phase 10, if you can plan that far, and you never can. So identifying what all those opportunities are, but also understanding that you can't accomplish all of them. So you're framing what those opportunities are and what your sort of priorities and sequencing should be, and what does the organization need to learn about in order to be able to tackle those opportunities better if we're delaying them until later. Lots of user feedback. So we've talked to the people who actually have problems we're trying to solve, and we're also building relationships with them so that we can continue to collect that feedback as we go along. So they've told us what we need. We go back to them in the implementation phase and say, okay, you said you needed this. Does this meet your need? And are we addressing it the right way? And some of the things that we do with collecting user stories, which we didn't talk about in any real detail, almost become test cases for the intranet itself. If you said you need a place to store, to provide HR benefits to the population, well, does this do that? Does it meet that test case that we built in the user story? And then finally, a roadmap. And that roadmap is a visual way to sort of understand, well, what is that sequencing? How long is this going to take? How many, we tend to break things down into waves or phases, because you can't do everything at once. And a lot of that is sort of rolling waves or phases. It's like going to the beach and seeing the waves rolling in. But you try and figure out, well, what's the most important stuff you need to do? Which sites have to be there for an initial launch? Without these sites, or without this content, or without covering the needs of this group of people, we don't have that minimum viable product for a new intranet that is going to show people that they're getting something that's useful. All right.
Great.
Patrick, a couple more thoughts at the end here.
Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts. I know we're at time, but the next steps are really reviewing plan and solutions, discussing the roadmap with your stakeholders. But the key to keep in mind is, drum roll, Mark, discovery is ongoing. On-paper discoveries are great. They start, you have the discovery, you have the delivery. But in real life, it's a continuous throughout the project type of mentality. So you might have a discovery, you might start work, you might discover some other concern or opportunity, you have another mini discovery, and so on and so on. So discovery is not a one and done. It really is throughout the life cycle of the project, because you never know what you're going to discover along the way that is going to fork you in a different direction.
Cool. So we have a handful of resources here. Some of the links that were on the slides that you saw are also on this resource page, and they will be in the notes on the Ask Some Praxis page when we get them put up there. If you'd like to see us live, we're coming up in Atlanta. Julie will be at TechCon 365 in Atlanta. There's a discount code there. We're busily planning Collab Days New England on October 17th, which will be in Burlington, Mass, in our neck of the woods. Our neck of the woods, very loosely defined because we're spread around.
Get to hear my accent live.
There you go. It sounds so much better in person too.
It really does.
I don't clip it.
And if you can join us on July 9th, when we're gonna look back on June and talk about the Microsoft 365 change highlights and maybe some things that were lowlights as well, given this crew. So thanks for joining us, and we hope we'll see you at the next Ask Some Praxis.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Some Praxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.